The Ghost of Dorothy Dingley by Defoe. In the beginning of this year, a disease happened in this town of Launceston, and some of my scholars died of it. Among others who fell under the malignity then triumphing was John Eliot, the eldest son of Edward Eliot of Treherne, Esquire, a stripling of about 16 years of age, but of more than common parts and ingenuity. At his own particular request, I preached at the funeral, which happened on the 20th day of June, 1665. In my discourse I spoke some words in commendation of the young gentleman, such as might endear his memory to those that knew him, and, withal, tended to preserve his example to the fry which went to school with him, and were to continue there after him. An ancient gentleman who was then in the church was much affected with the discourse, and was often heard to repeat, the same evening, an expression I then used out of Virgil, et puer ipse fuit cantare dignus. The reason why this grave gentleman was so concerned at the character was a reflection he made upon a son of his own, who, being about the same age and but a few months before not unworthy of the like character I gave of the young Mr. Eliot, was now, by a strange accident, quite lost as to his parents' hopes, and all expectation of any further comfort by him. The funeral rites being over, I was no sooner come out of the church, but I found myself most courteously accosted by this old gentleman, and with unusual importunity almost forced against my humour to see his house that night. I explained to him that this was a time of inconvenience, but was constrained to leave a promise behind me to wait upon him at his own house the following Monday. I agreed to this, and this seemed to satisfy him. On the Monday I went, and paid my promised visit. I was met with entertainment as free and plentiful as one could have wished. There was also, I found, a neighbouring minister who pretended to call in accidentally, but by the sequel I suppose it otherwise. After dinner the brother of the coat undertook to show me the gardens, where, as we were walking, he gave me the first discovery of what was mainly intended in all of this treat and compliment. First he began to tell of the infortunity of the family in general, and then gave an example in the youngest son. He related what a hopeful, sprightly lad he lately was, and how melancholic and sottish he was now grown. Then he did with much passion lament that this ill humour should so incredibly subdue his reason, for, says he, the poor boy believes himself to be haunted with ghosts, and is confident that he meets with an evil spirit in a certain field about half a mile away from this place, as often as he goes that way to school. It was the main drift of all these three to persuade me that either the boy was lazy and glad of any excuse to keep from school, or that he was in love with some wench and ashamed to confess it. And I was accordingly to discover the root of the matter, and to dissuade, advise, or reprove him, but chiefly, by all means, to undeceive him as to the fancy of ghosts and spirits. I soon entered into a close confidence with the youth, and at first was very cautious not to displease him, but by smooth words to ingratiate myself and get within him, for I doubted he would be too distrustful or too reserved. But we had scarcely passed the first situation, and begun to speak of the business, before I found that there needed no policy to screw myself into his breast, for he most openly, and with all obliging candour, did aver that he loved his book, and desired nothing more than to be bred a scholar, that he had not the least respect for any of womankind as his mother gave out, and that the only request he would make to his parents was, that they would but believe his constant assertions concerning the woman he was disturbed with in the field called Higher Broom Quartils. He told me, with all naked freedom and a flood of tears, that his friends were unkind and unjust to him, neither to believe nor pity him, and that if any man, here making a bow to me, would but go with him to the place, he might be convinced that the thing was real. By this time he found me apt to compassionate his condition, and to be attentive to his relation of it, and therefore he went on his way. This woman which appears to me, saith he, lived a neighbour here to my father, and died about 8 years since. Her name Dorothy Dingley. She never speaks to me, but passeth by hastily, and always leaves the footpath to me, and she commonly meets me 2 or 3 times in the breadth of the field. He continued, it was about 2 months before I took any notice of it, and though the shape of her face was in my memory, yet I did not recall the name of the person, but without more thoughtfulness I did suppose it was some woman who lived thereabout, and had frequent occasion that way, nor did I imagine anything else, before she began to meet me constantly, morning and evening, and always in the same field, and sometimes 2 or 3 in the breadth of it. The first time I took notice of her was about 1 year since, and when I first began to suspect and believe it to be a ghost, I had courage enough not to be afraid, but kept it to myself a good while, and only wondered very much about it. I did often speak to it, but never had it a word in answer. Then I changed my way, and went to school the under-horse road, but she always met me in the narrow lane, between the quarry park and the nursery, which was worse. At length I began to be terrified at it, and prayed continually that God would either free me from it, or let me know the meaning of it. Night and day, sleeping and waking, the shape was ever running in my mind, and I did often repeat these places of Scripture. With that the boy took a small Bible from his pocket. Job 7:14. Thou scarest me with dreams, and terrifiest me through visions. And Deuteronomy 28:67. In the morning thou shalt say, Would God it were even, and at even thou shalt say, Would God it were morning. For the fear of thine heart, wherewith thou shalt fear, and for the sight of thine eyes, which thou shalt see. I was very much pleased with the lad's ingenuity in the application of these pertinent scriptures to his condition, and desired him to proceed. When, says he, I became pensive, and my family became aware of a change in me, I was urged to speak of my troubles. I told my brother William of it, and he privately acquainted my father and mother, and they kept it to themselves for some time. The success of this discovery was only this. They did sometimes laugh at me, and sometimes chide me, but still commanded me to keep to my school, and put such fopperies out of my head. I did accordingly go to school often, but always met the woman in the way. The boy and I talked of this for nearly 2 hours. Our conference in the orchard, which ended with my proffer to him that without making any privy to our intents, I would next morning walk with him to the place, about 6 o'clock. He was transported with joy at the mention of it, and replied, But will you, sir? Will you, sir? Thank God! Now I hope I shall be relieved. From this conclusion we retired into the house. The gentleman, his wife, and Mr. Sam were impatient to know the event, insomuch that they came out of the parlour into the hall to meet us, and, Seeing the lad look cheerfully, the first compliment from the old man was, "Come, Mr. Ruddle, you have talked with him. I hope he will now have more wit. An idle boy, an idle boy." At these words, the lad ran up to his own chamber without replying, and I soon stopped the curiosity of the three expectants by telling them I had promised silence, and was resolved to be as good as my word. But when things were riper, they might know all. At present I desired them to rest in my faithful promise that I would do my utmost in their service, and for the good of their son. With this they were silenced, I cannot say satisfied. The next morning, before 5 o'clock, the lad was in my chamber, and very brisk. I arose and went with him. The field he led me to I guessed to be about 20 acres, in an open country, and about 3 furlongs from any house. We went into the field, and had not gone about a third part, before the spectrum, in the shape of a woman, with all the circumstances he had described her to me in the orchard the day before, as much as the suddenness of its appearance and emanation would permit me to discover, met and passed by. I was a little surprised at it, and though I had taken up a firm resolution to speak to it, yet I had not the power, nor indeed durst I look back. Yet I took care not to show any fear to my pupil and guide, and therefore, only telling him that I was satisfied in the truth of his complaint, we walked to the end of the field and returned, nor did the ghost meet us that time above once. I perceived in the young man a kind of boldness mixed with astonishment, the first caused by my presence and the proof he had given of his own relation, and the other by the sight of his persecutor. In short, we went home, I somewhat puzzled, he much animated. At our return, the gentlewoman, whose inquisitiveness had missed us, watched to speak with me. I gave her a convenience and told her that my opinion was her son's complaint was not to be slighted, nor altogether discredited, yet that my judgment in the case was not settled. I gave her caution, moreover, that the thing might not yet take wind, lest the whole county should ring with what we had yet no assurance of. In this juncture of time I had business which would admit no delay, wherefore I went to Launceston that evening, but promised to see them again next week. Yet I was prevented by an occasion which pleaded a sufficient excuse, for my wife was, that week, brought home from a neighbour's house very ill. However, my mind was still much on the adventure. I studied the case, and about 3 weeks after, I went again, resolving by the help of God to see the utmost. The next morning, being the 27th day of June, 1665, I went to the haunted field by myself, and walked the breadth of it without any encounter. I returned and took the other walk, and then the spectrum appeared to me, much about the same place where I saw it before, when the young gentleman was with me. In my thoughts it moved swifter than the time before, and about 10 feet distance from me on my right hand, insomuch that I had not time to speak, as I had determined with myself beforehand. The evening of this day, the parents of the son and myself being in the chamber where I lay, I propounded to them our going all together to the place next morning, and after some asseveration that there was no danger in it, we all resolved upon it. The morning being come, lest we should alarm the family of servants, they went under the pretence of seeing a field of wheat, and I took my horse and fetched a compass another way, and so met at the stile we had appointed. Thence we all four walked leisurely into the quartils, and had passed above half the field just before the ghost made appearance. It came over the stile just before us, and moved with that swiftness that by the time we had gone 6 or 7 steps, it passed by. I immediately turned my head and ran after it with the young man by my side. We saw it pass over the stile by which we had entered, but no farther. I stepped upon the hedge at one place, he at another, but could discern nothing, whereas I dare aver that the swiftest horse in England could not have conveyed himself out of sight in that short space of time. 2 things I observed in this day's appearance. 1, that a spaniel dog, who followed the company unregarded, did bark and run away as the spectrum passed by, whence it is easy to conclude that it was not our fear or fancy which made the apparition, and 2, that the motion of the spectrum was not gradation or by steps and moving of the feet, but a kind of gliding, as children upon the ice, or a boat down a swift river, to proceed. This ocular evidence clearly convinced, but withal strangely frightened, the old gentleman and his wife, who knew this Dorothy Dingley in her lifetime. They were at her burial, and now plainly saw her features in this present apparition. I encouraged them as well as I could, but after this they went no more. However, I was resolved to proceed, and to use lawful means as God hath discovered and learned men have successfully practised in these irregular cases. The next morning, being Thursday, I went out very early by myself, and walked for almost an hour's space in meditation and prayer in the field adjoining to the Quartills. Soon after 5, I stepped over the stile into the disturbed field, and had not gone above 30 or 40 paces before the ghost appeared at the farther stile. I spoke to it with a loud voice, in some sentences, as the way of these dealings directed me, whereupon it approached, but slowly, and when I came near, it moved not. I spake again, and it answered, in a voice neither very audible nor intelligible. I was not in the least terrified, and therefore persisted until it spake again, and gave me satisfaction. But the work could not be finished at this time, wherefore the same evening, an hour after sunset, it met me again near the same place, and after a few words on each side, it quietly vanished, and neither doth appear since, nor ever will more, to any man's disturbance. The discourse in the morning lasted about 1/4 of an hour. These things are true, and I know them to be so with as much certainty as eyes and ears can give me, and until I can be persuaded that my senses do deceive me about their proper object, and that my persuasion deprive myself of the strongest inducement to believe the Christian religion, I must and will assert that these things in this paper are true. As for the manner of my proceeding, I find no reason to be ashamed of it, for I can justify it to men of good principles, discretion, and recondite learning, though in this case I choose to content myself in the assurance of the thing, rather than be at the unprofitable trouble to persuade others to believe it. For I know full well with what difficulty relations of so uncommon a nature and practice obtain relief. Not one scholar in 10,000, though otherwise of excellent learning, knows anything of it, or the way how to manage it. This ignorance breeds fear and abhorrence of that which otherwise might be of incomparable benefit to mankind. But I, being a clergyman and a stranger in these parts, do apprehend silence and secrecy to be my best security.